Hi everyone, this is Matthew Jennifer Card Runners, and I'm here with Button vs. Blind Play video number 4, and this is going to be Big Blind vs. Button Play continued. So in the next couple videos following this one, I am going to write out what I would do with my entire range, but this is the last video for a while where we're going to just generate a bunch of flops. We're going to talk about what looks like the really close decisions, what looks like the really easy ones, so we continue to build on that framework of whether or not we bet, whether or not we check, and then once we have that general idea down, then, as I said, in the next few videos, I'll actually be writing out what I would do with every single hand. All right, so flop number 2, we get 3 of spades, 6 of spades, 4 of clubs, and again, this is random. I know it's similar to the last flop in the last video. And in all of these hand examples, we're once again assuming that we cold called a button open in the big blind, then we checked on the flop, and then the button bet, and we want to know what to do. All right, so same deal as before. You have to understand that if you get a 6 high flop in the big blind, you just got unlucky with your overall range to get this flop. It's no different than getting a bad turn or river card for your specific hand. Here we just got a bad flop for our range. So it doesn't mean we did anything wrong pre-flop to kind of miss this flop. It's just not common the board's going to be 6 high. It happens sometimes, and I randomly generated the flop, and we got this one here, but it's just not that common. So the fact that position is so valuable here and we have a weak range and we just don't have that many pairs doesn't mean we did anything wrong. We just got an unlucky flop. All right, so let's continue with this flop. So what are some easy check raises here? And first off, we're going to do the value check raises. So what are some easy value check raises? Pause if you want. But I would just say any really strong hand. This isn't a board where you want to give free cards. So if you have a set, a straight, or a 2 pair, I would usually check raise here. Now, we probably 3-bet a lot of the hands that can make 2 pairs and can make straights. Like we probably 3-bet a lot of the 5-7, 6-4 suited, 4-3 suited stuff. It depends really on what you do overall with your range. But if you do have those hands here, I would likely go ahead and go for the check raise. Very hard to slow play here. So what are some easy-ish check calls? So what are some hands that you feel pretty comfortable check calling with? I would just say most pairs, including most 6x, 4x, and 3x hands, also call some like ace-9, ace-ace high card hands with runner-runner flush draws and some 5x hands. So you just kind of want a mix of everything when you're check calling. You want some draws, some, high overcards, some random pairs, pretty much the stuff that, won't retain its equity all that well if we check raise it, but are still reasonably strong enough hands that we want to check call. So this one should be pretty easy. And then what are some good check raise bluffs? And I would say king 8, 8-7 of clubs, 9-8 of clubs, some 7x and some 5x hands. So let's go one hand at a time. Why do I think it's reasonable to check raise bluff king of spades, 8 of clubs? Well, the first thing I would say is it's a hand that has some pretty robust equity. It has the runner-runner flush draw with the king high, so the king of spades can, make the second nut flush, or even the nut flush if the turn of the river is the ace of spades. So that's pretty good. And the other reason why I like check raising it too is we might be able to make some hands that dominate us fold. Like I think especially in practice, very often you're going to check on this flop, your opponent's going to bet the flop with king 9, king 10, maybe even king jack, and then when you check raise it, you make him fold. He'll probably bet the flop with ace 8 more than he should. And when you check raise king 8, you'll make him fold. So you can make some hands that dominate you fold. And then the other thing too is like just at the end of the day, turning a pair of kings or a pair of 8s is good. So one thing that's important to keep in mind as you get better is when you're first learning how to play, you tend to really want to play hands that are easy to play. You're not able to do that as you get better and you play against better opponents. So yeah, we're going to sometimes check raise with king 8 here. We'll turn an 8 and our opponent will have pocket 9s. Or we'll turn a king and our opponent will have, king queen or king 6. And that sucks and it's hard to play that hand and you usually end up feeling poorly no matter what you do if that happens, right? Like if you turn a king and your opponent has 2 pair, if you end up putting a lot of money in and losing, you feel bad. If you end up folding top pair, you feel bad. So it's important not to be too results oriented. Understanding you'll sometimes get in tough spots when you check raise a hand like king 8 here. But at the end of the day, it can make the second nut flush and it can turn some pretty good pairs. So I think it's a reasonable hand to check raise here. 8-7 of clubs. This one everyone should be really familiar with. It's a gut shot and then it also has 3 to a flush. 9-8 of clubs is pretty close to 3 to a flush, 3 to a straight. And then 7x and 5x hands are either gut shots or open in straight draws. So the rest should be, pretty comfortable. The king 8 off is probably a little bit more difficult. And then when we do go over every single hand in our range, that's where we'll focus on making sure we're having the proper amount of check raise bluffs. So hopefully everyone is pretty comfortable with this. All right, so let's do the really tricky part now. So what about pocket 7s? pause for a moment and think if you'd like. I would probably check call pocket sevens here. It's a hand that is difficult to check call because pretty much every turn card where you face a barrel, it's going to be difficult unless the turn's a 5. But at the end of the day, I really don't want to get 3-bet on this flop. I'm going to be lost on a lot of turns if I check raise here and the pot gets bigger. So I would probably rather just check call it. Having said that, I could see an argument for even check raising. Because if you check raise, you might make your opponent fold 2 overcards. You might make your opponent call with a pair of 6s. It's going to be very hard to play 7s regardless of whether you check call or check raise. So I can see an argument for both lines. I personally would take what I think is a little bit of an easier and safer line and check call. But it would not surprise me at all if, in theory, this is a check raise. I think it's a check call. I would check call it. But just understand why check raising can make sense here. It can make overcards fold and get value from worse hands. And it can also put some check calling hands into your range on later streets. So I would have thought, a couple years ago, check raising 7s would be insane here. But I really don't think it is. Ace-2 of hearts. Okay, so this one, this one's a good one. I actually made these slides over a month ago, and I haven't had time to do the commentary yet. So I actually guess I chose a pretty tricky one because now I'm actually stopping to think here. So let's think. One thing I like about check raising is the ace-2 doesn't have as much showdown value as I'd like as a check call. Because if we check call and try to get to showdown, we can lose to better ace highs. If we check raise it, we also might make our opponent fold an ace that has us out kicked in case our opponent was betting on this flop with a hand like ace-7, ace-8, ace-9, ace-10. And on this board texture, it's pretty reasonable for the opponent to bet with those hands because he doesn't want to give a lot of free cards. And, ace-9, ace-8, ace-10, all those cards can, even if, their flop bet's called, they will turn the best pair pretty often, or can even win at showdown. So, for example, if the opponent bets ace-10, and we check call on this flop with ace-8, he just got additional value, as well as preventing us from getting free cards with some other hands in our range. So I think with that in mind, I would actually go for the check raise here. Try to make the opponent fold some overcards, some better aces, and then we still do have the kind of awkward gut shot. Because if the turn card does come a 5, obviously we're at the lower end. But I don't think this hand's strong enough to check call. So I think I'd rather check raise it. And please don't get me confused. Just because a hand's not strong enough to check call does not mean we should check raise it. But if I do think check calling here is negative EV, I can say, okay, let's throw that option out. Now I have to ask myself, do I think check raising is profitable or should I check fold? It looks close, but I think we can probably fit in the check raise. And again, this is something where it would probably benefit me to write out all my hand combos and make sure I'm not check raising too much. But yeah, I think it's close. I think it's really close between check folding and check. They're all really close. Okay, so ace-2 with the ace of spades, that I'm check raising. So apparently when I made these slides like a month ago, I intentionally set it up to show like this one might be really close. Maybe it's slightly towards a fold, but there's no way I'm folding ace-2 with the ace of spades. Everything I just said still applies with the ace-2 with the ace of spades. The only difference is now we're consistently going to turn a spade after check raising that can barrel incredibly effectively. So I would definitely check raise the ace-2 off with the ace of spades. The ace-2 of hearts, that one's closer. Maybe it should even just be check folded, but again, it would probably help me here if I wrote out all the combos to see if I'm check raising too much or too little. King 10 off. So King 10 off, I think I would just check call. It's a real hand, in my opinion, where check calling keeps a lot of your opponent's dominated 10s and dominated kings in his range. And then it's going to be a hand that we bluff on the river to make our opponent fold ace highs. So King 10 with the king of spades especially, I would check call because I want to keep my opponent's weaker kings, weaker 10s, weaker flush draws in his range. And we are going to pretty often have a chance to bluff when we check call on the flop, the turn goes check, check, then we bluff the river. And the other cool thing too is like if we did check call this flop, with a king 10 off, with a king of spades, and we turn to a spade, maybe we'll want to turn our hand into a check raise bluff, and that would make sense because we would be check raising on the turn with some flushes, and then we want to have some air hands too. Jack of spades, 8 of clubs. So this hand to me looks weak enough that we can just check fold it. And the more I'm thinking about it, maybe we should have check folded the ace-2 of hearts too. But yeah, I think this hand, the Jack 8 off, it's not the worst hand we can have in our range. But this is a board texture that's very hard to defend on. And, we're often going to run a runner the tainted flush with the Jack of spades, or at least more often than we would with the king of spades. And then we're more likely to be outkicked if we turn a pair with Jack 8 than with king 10. So with all that in mind, I would just check fold the king 8. the jack 8, and then I would call the king 10, as I already mentioned. So my overall thoughts on this board is if it's close, just fold. This especially applies the lower stakes you play and the more likely you are to make mistakes. I'm not one to back off on spots that are close. You have to take high variance lines. You have to be willing to make big bluffs and not be results oriented if they don't work. But this board's just so hard to play. It's about one of the hardest positions in 6 max you can ever be in. So if it does seem really close, in practice especially, I would recommend folding unless you have like a HUD that tells you, hey, even though it looks a little bit close at a glance, you can exploit your opponent. So chances are, if I'm playing, I think I'm better than everyone else at the table, and most by a pretty wide margin. Rig is a hell of a thing, so you actually have to be significantly better to make money. That said, if I think a spot is close or break even, I'm still going to fold. I'm out of position with a crap range. I'm going to face many difficult decisions and make many more mistakes even than someone I'm better than. So, while maybe calling with a hand should be plus 0.0 APB if I played it perfectly, meh, he can just take it. I'm not one to back off spots that are only slightly plus EV, but I can't figure out what's right here, and it's a close spot anyways. So it's just important to keep in mind that even if you're better than your opponent, you're probably going to make more mistakes with a terrible range when you're out of position on a board that's super hard to play out of position than your opponent is when he has a stronger range and he's in position on a board that's very easy to play in position. So with that in mind, I would just fold spots that look relatively close. And I probably should have listened to my own advice back here when I came to the ace-2 of hearts. I probably should just check fold this. I don't like folding an ace high in a gut shot, and that's probably why I intentionally put this in when I made these slides like a little bit over a month ago. So usually I will not fold a gut shot with ace high, but here it looks like it can be okay because I don't think it's going to play all that effectively. And at the end of the day, I'll just be honest. Even if in theory this should be slightly profitable as a check raise, I'm probably not going to play it well enough unless I know how I can exploit my opponent. The last thing to keep in mind is you have a limited amount of focus and attention anyways that you can apply to all your tables. So if you are in a very, very difficult, super slightly plus EV spot, it might be better to just pass it up and focus on the other tables and make less mistakes that matter much more. Okay, so flop number 3. All right, so the flop is Jack 10-7 rainbow. So while position is valuable here, the fact that there are 2 high cards, considering the Jack and the 10 are both reasonably high, it makes it much easier for us to check a call, as well as increases our overall equity for our entire range. Because pre-flop, we were calling with a lot of 10s and a lot of jacks because we were getting such a good price, and we happened to hit them here. So we should be able to defend a lot here. Do we defend enough to prevent villain from c-betting any 2 cards? I'm not sure, and I'm not going to write out my entire range here. But we probably can make lots of plus EV check calls and check raises. And at the end of the day, we always check call or check raise when it's plus EV and fold when it isn't. So this isn't a spot where if our opponent can profitably bet any 2 cards, we know we're doing something wrong. So since this isn't that type of spot, there's no reason to freak out if our opponent, can bet half pot on this flop and make money with any 2 cards. Not a big deal. So even though we can defend aggressively here, there's no reason to obsess over just exactly how aggressively we can defend because that's unsolvable. And we don't have that threshold where we know we need to defend, enough to prevent our opponent from being able to profitably bet any 2 cards. All right. So moving on. So what are some easy value check raises here? So sets, 2 pairs, straights, some combo draws. I hope it's not getting too redundant, but these are usually the type of hands you'll value check raise. A lot of playing good, solid poker is really doing the same kind of concepts again and again and just recognizing, what hands fit the criteria you need to, check call them or check raise them or fold. So, yeah, check raise is really good stuff here. You don't really want to give free cards. So what are some easy check raise bluffs? So this one's probably going to be a little bit harder, but we know when we look for a check raise bluff, we look for a hand that retains its equity well against a strong range. So with that in mind, probably some 7x hands, some gut shots, and the usual 3 to a flush, 3 to a straight stuff. So again, it probably seems a little redundant, but that's usually the type of stuff you check raise bluff. The hands with the robust equity, so gut shots, sometimes weak pairs, and then my personal favorite, 3 to a flush, 3 to a straight. And then remember, check raising, even bluffing, just has to be more plus EV than calling. And the reason why I wrote that is since I mentioned how you can bluff a very weak pair, it's possible a hand like 7-6 of clubs is in theory a check raise here. But just because we should, in theory, check raise 7-6 of clubs, and it makes sense why it might make a good check raise, right? It has 5 outs, 2 trips, or 2 pair, and it has a runner flush draw. But even though it's, even if it's a check raise in theory, it doesn't mean that check calling wouldn't have also been profitable. It just means check raising is more profitable than calling. So always keep that in mind. You're always just taking the most plus EV line. Just because you check raise bluff doesn't mean it wouldn't have been a profitable check call. And the terms value check raise and bluff check raise don't work perfectly anyways. Okay, so we don't just bluff with hands that can't call. Some 7X are probably more plus EV to call, others to check raise bluff. So yeah, some you're going to want to call, some you're going to want to bluff. And even when you think about like the theory behind it, it's nice to have some 7s in your check calling range and your check raising range, because that will allow you to be able to represent trips in both ranges, which is a nice thing to be able to do. So what are some easy check calls? Pause for a moment and think if you need to, but it's also probably redundant. Your pairs, Jack X, 10X, your good 7s, the ones with the good kickers that your opponent will often double barrel, like the Ace 7 and King 7. I would definitely check call these rather than check raise them. You could also check raise some jacks if you wanted to, probably, to allow you to, make your opponent pay more to see the turn when he has a draw. And it will allow you to check call on a later street more easily. But for the most part, I would pretty much check call all your Jack X's. Unless you're really, really good and really wanting to do some like fancy balance stuff, I would not check raise the Jack X. That said, in theory, you probably should check raise a couple of Jack X's here. But I definitely would not recommend doing that. If you need to check raise Jack X here, you will probably already know it before watching this video. Okay, but how about the following? So Queen 9. So would you rather check raise Queen 9 or would you rather check call it? Pause for a moment and think if you'd like, but my guess is this is a really good example of a hand that should use a mixed strategy. We want to be able to represent some straights on turn cards, whether or not we check raised or check called. And the Queen 9 works both well as a check call and as a check raise. As a check raise, the big advantage obviously is the equity is super, super robust for Queen 9. So if you check raise it and you make the straight, you pretty much have the nuts, so you're going to win no matter how strong your opponent's range is. The advantage of check calling it is you can't get 3-bet on the flop. It really sucks when you check raise Queen 9 and your opponent 3-bets you here. So I think Queen 9 can go in both ranges. It can be both check called and check raised. It's very profitable in both ranges. Whether or not you should check raise or check call is really going to depend on your specific opponent. I used to check call hands like this more than I do now. Now I'm a little bit more likely to check raise them, but I feel very comfortable doing either line. Check raising's good, check calling's good. Ace of clubs, 8 of clubs. Okay, so this one has a gut shot, some showdown value, and 3 to a flush. So again, a good example of a hand that I think can be both check called and check raised profitably. I think I would lean a little bit more towards, this one looks really close again too, and it's possible even this hand's a mixed strategy where you can do both. This one looks really, really close as well. So I don't have a problem with check calling it or check raising it. I think I like being the aggressor if it looks really close, so I would probably go ahead and check raise it. But I think check calling it's fine too. And if you do check call it, you're going to have to just look at the turn and river card to see whether or not you want to bluff. Because ace 8 can lose to your opponent's like random pocket 3s if he was bluffing them on the flop. Or maybe your opponent ends up betting on the flop with ace 9 and you end up losing. So ace 8, the one thing that I don't like about check calling is I think it is awkward knowing whether or not you should bluff the river. Because on one hand, if you're going to bluff the river with ace 8 of clubs, then the showdown value of the ace high didn't really matter because you just ended up bluffing it. But you also are going to be kind of reluctant to check it through. Because even if the turn's like a 4 and the river's a 3, your opponent might just flip over a random 4 or a random 3 and beat you. So with that in mind, I think I've convinced myself that I like check raising here. Because I don't think, even though ace 8 will be the better hand pretty often on the flop, it's not going to be able to check down and win at showdown, I think, all that effectively. If the turn and the river do come low cards, the opponent might have just made a very weak pair that we want to make fold. So because of that, I think I'd go for a check raise bluff. But again, it's pretty close. I'm intentionally asking the hands that I think are quite difficult. 8 of diamonds, 6 of diamonds. Okay, I lied. I don't think that one's that hard. I would just check raise bluff it. So with ace 8, we turn a pair of 8s, we have a better kicker. We can turn a better top pair with a pair of aces. 8-6 can't really turn in that many good pairs. So with that in mind, 3 to a flush, a gut shot, doesn't really turn good pairs. I'd rather just check raise bluff it. King 9. So king 9 is going to be somewhat similar to queen 9, right? It's almost, yeah, queen 9 and king 9 are just pretty much going to be the same thing. Realize king 9 is double gutted. That's a mistake people make all the time when I talk to people, and I know I've made it too. It's hard to tell something's double gutted right off the bat for a lot of us, but king 9's double gutted, so it's essentially the same thing as an open-ended straight draw. It's very, very similar. So the same things we talked about with queen 9 will apply to king 9. And then 9-7. 9-7, I would prefer to check a call, because 9-7 does, it still can pretty easily win at showdown, right? 9-7 has a lot more showdown value than the ace-8. And on top of that, 9-7 just does pretty well on a 9 or an 8 or a 7 turn. It also might do okay on a queen turn too, because the queen gives it an open-ended straight draw, and even the king gives us the equivalent of an open-ended straight draw. So both the king and the queen will give us 8 outs to a straight. So with that in mind, since the king's not that bad, the queen's not that bad, the 9's good, the 8's great, the 7's great, I'd go ahead and check call the 9-7. Now, granted, if 9-7 were to make a straight, that would be good whether or not we check raise it on the flop or whether or not we check called. But I think the pair of 7s will be better if we check call it rather than check raise it. So in other words, the pair of 7s is what I would call not robust equity. So the pair of 7s gets much weaker as our opponent's range gets stronger. So with that in mind, I'd rather check call, keep his range weaker, keep the pair of 7s better. So the next randomly generated flop is 8-8-6 with a flush draw, but I'm not going to do this board in detail since we've already done a few 8 high and lower boards, and these boards are pretty uncommon, and a lot of the things that we've already talked about will be very similar on this board. I will say you should note how easily you can be exploited if you always or never check raise your 8x hands. So we already talked a little bit about how a lot of times in theory, it can make sense to take, 2 different lines with the same hand. They should have the same EV. Here, if you just look conceptually at this board, 8-8-6, if you never check raise your 8s on the flop, your opponent's going to be able to adjust and exploit you pretty easily. If you always check raise your 8x on this flop, then your opponent's going to be able to adjust and exploit you pretty easily. So here's a board where you'll mix up what you do with a lot of your really good hands. So think about what's the counter strategy if you always call your trips, what's the counter strategy if you never call your trips. Should be pretty simple, so just keep that in mind as we go to the next board. And since we are skipping this board, feel free to ask me questions about it if you want to in the comments thread, but I think most people will be able to see the counter strategies pretty easily here. All right, flop number 5, King Queen 2 with 2 hearts. So this is a good one. This one's different than the other ones we've done. So the first thing that should go through our mind is fist pump. This is a flop that's pretty easy to defend when we're out of position. It's not like the 6 high board, which was a nightmare. It's just straight up easy to check call with a whole bunch of King X and Queen X hands. Position is also less valuable here than most people would expect because there are few overcards. Yeah, position's always good, especially when like flushes and straights and stuff come. But for the most part, position's not as valuable here as it is on like an 8 high board, and it's not even close. We should feel lucky we got this flop overall with our range because it is a board that's easy to play when we're out of position, and we will have a lot of pairs of kings and queens. So kind of sticking with what I mentioned earlier, which is like a lot of playing good solid poker is doing the same thing over again and again. When you see a board like this and you're out of position, you're just going to check call pretty much all your King X and Queen X hands. You don't have like top pair, top kicker stuff. So that might seem like too simple. Like how can you think that it's correct in theory to check a call nearly all your King X and Queen X's? Because that's what plays the hands most effectively. They don't have very robust equity, and we're not afraid of giving free cards, so you just take the obvious line. So if you're watching this, especially if you're playing really low stakes, it's pretty common to see people like, especially if they think they're having a bad run of cards or they're not doing as well as they wish they were, they try to get really fancy for no reason. There's no reason to get fancy in most spots, especially here. You just check call your King X and Queen X, and it's pretty easy to do. All right. So, what are some easy check raises? And as usual, the easiest check raises to start out with are the value check raises. So what would you value check raise here? Go with King 2, Queen 2, and Pocket 2s. Easy enough, right? 2 pairs and sets. It's the same thing we're usually doing. You can slow play once in a while, but in practice, I'd always check raise all of these. Sometimes we'll have to make decisions on future streets when we have King 2 or Queen 2, but I don't want to give a bunch of free cards. And the risk with it, of course, when you check call with these hands, if you check call with King 2 or Queen 2, it's really hard to check raise when the turn card comes a jack or a 10 or a 9 or a heart. So I'd rather get the check raise in now when I can confidently do it before I end up risking, having to check call on the turn, in which case my opponent's almost guaranteed to see 2 additional cards. So to just make that clear, if we check call with queen 2 on this flop rather than check raise it, and the turn card comes a 9 or a 10, it doesn't even matter if it's a heart. I'm not going to be able to check raise on the turn, or at least I don't think check raising on the turn will be as effective as check calling. So once that turn card comes a 9 or a 10, I know my opponent's going to get to see the turn and the river. And, it's pretty unlikely that our opponent will have queen 2 beat on the flop. It's very unlikely. When he gets to see a turn, it gets more likely, but when he gets to see a turn and the river, by then queen 2 can pretty easily be outdrawn. So I'd rather not allow my opponent to see the turn and the river very, very cheaply, consistently. So that's why I'd pretty much always check raise king 2 and queen 2. So yeah, I want to make my opponent pay to see additional cards with his pairs and gut shots, and I don't want to let him runner me cheaply. It's not that rare to have your opponent runner a flush that beats you when you have king 2. The other thing I want to mention is you might say, like, well, wait a second. If we check raise all of our king 2, queen 2, and pocket 2s, our range is capped. You're right. But unless you're playing opponents that are good enough to consistently overbet you, I've mentioned many times in almost all the videos that I make that people don't overbet anywhere near as often as I think is, game theoretically correct. So that makes it very easy for me to justify never slow playing. Though argument for slow playing pocket 2s, queen 2, and king 2, I think is often, hey, maybe if we slow play them, our opponent will overbet later. But if our opponents aren't actually overbetting later, and the vast majority of opponents aren't, I think your argument to slow play these hands gets much weaker. If your opponents make up imaginary rules that they follow, like they always bet 2/3 or 3/4 of the pot on the turn, then that just makes it easier for you to justify never slow playing. So by playing these aggressively on the flop and not slow playing, you're exploiting your opponents who don't know how to overbet. So how about some easy check calls? All right, pretty much all king X and queen X. I would never check raise any king X or queen X here, and I would never fold them. We don't have any king X or queen X with really good kickers. So yeah, just an easy check call. We're not afraid of giving free cards. I've already said that enough times. And then I would call with some of the usual ace X stuff and draw stuff, of course, too. We have to be able to bluff after our opponent checks back the turn. So we want to check call with some hands that will make good bluffs later if the turn goes check. We also want to check call with some hands that can just win at showdown, which might be some of our like ace X hands, in addition to like a lot of our queen X hands. So yeah, check call this flop with some ace X, check call it with some draws. Like it'd be fine to check call on this flop with a hand like jack 9 or jack 10. Check raising them can be fine too, but check calling's fine as well. Yeah, I even mentioned here jack 10 can go either way. I like check calling with ace X suited, especially if you have like, when I say ace X suited, I really mean ace X that can run to the flush. So it could be ace X off with the ace of hearts, or it could be ace X with 2 clubs. And then you can also call with 9s to 3s. Maybe check calling on the turn with like 3s or 4s or 5s might be negative EV. I don't know exactly where to draw the line. With pocket 9s or pocket 8s, if we can have them in our range, I would for sure call with them, because they're less likely to be outdrawn and they beat some of our opponents, lower pocket pairs, like if our opponent has pocket 6s. If we have 3s or 4s or 5s, then that's harder to tell, because those hands will, if they're already beat, they're not really going to outdraw the opponent, and they'll often get outdrawn when they are ahead, or they'll often get bluffed away. So, 3s, 4s, and 5s are kind of difficult to tell exactly what to do. And even though 3s, 4s, and 5s have more showdown value than ace X with the backdoor, ace X with the runner flush draw might play better. So it's tough to know exactly what ace X is and what, pocket pairs to check call with, but you're going to often be calling with a good amount of them. And I'm sure I asked some tough ones when I go to the hard spot questions. So, all right, so the hard ones are coming up. So ace 7 of diamonds. So ace 7 off, no backdoor runner flush draw. What would you do here? I think it's going to be a check fold. I think the hand's not strong enough to defend. I think I would probably check call like ace 9, but I don't think I would check call ace 7. I could be wrong here, and this is just going to showcase how I think to really confidently know what to do here, you're going to have actually needed to sit down and count combos, which I'm going to do in later videos of this series. So for right now, I think it's a fold, but I've had my mind blown many a times before when I do Flopzilla stuff, so maybe I'm going to find out that it's actually a pretty bad fold. But as is, I think it's a close fold, and I would probably call with like ace-9. Ace-7 with the ace of hearts, there's no way I fold this, now that we have the ace-7 with the ace of hearts. See, this is a board texture where I think we can check raise pretty aggressively with a lot of 2 pairs, and I don't think we have a lot of obvious bluffing hands. Like, look at this board texture. You don't have that many, like 3 to a flush, 3 to a straight. You have some, and a lot of times they're tricky. Like, Jack 5 of clubs or Jack 6 of clubs, that's 3 to a flush, 3 to a straight. But it might not be something that immediately pops to your mind. Having said all that, I need to make sure that I'm bluffing aggressively enough here. And I think it's kind of hard to check call the flop with ace-7 off with the ace of hearts and then check call again on like a 4 of hearts turn. You probably can, but it's not ideal. So because of that, I think I'd rather take the aggressive line. I'd rather check raise the ace-7 off here. And then, I hope I turn either a 7 or an ace or a heart, which will happen pretty often. And then especially when the turn's a heart, it's pretty easy to know to just keep barreling. So definitely don't fold the ace-7 off with this ace of hearts, and I think I would check raise it. Jack 9, I think I already mentioned it can probably go either way. It has some really robust equity, but it's also a hand that can check call and make a very clear bluff if the turn checks through. Ace-9, spoiler alert apparently, yeah, that's the one I would check call. And again, I don't know exactly where to draw the line with the ace-x hands. I'm sure players better than me have a much stronger opinion, but we'll develop that stronger opinion when we actually start writing out what to do with all of our combos and looking in more depth, like, okay, how often is ace-7 beat on this flop? How much equity does it have against the opponent's betting range? Are we defending enough hand combos? Ace-2. All right, well, ace-2, that one I think is a pretty easy check call. It just has significantly more showdown value than the hands like ace-7 and ace-9. And then what I like about check calling with ace-2 is a lot of times the opponent will bet the flop with a hand like ace-10 or ace-9 or ace-8 or ace-7. Even if he should check some of those, a lot of people will bet with them. And then if you check call with ace-2 and the turn card comes in ace, got him. So for that reason especially, that the opponent will barrel a lot of aces, and he'll even barrel the 2 pretty aggressively. We don't have many 2s in our range. I like the check call. 6-5 of hearts. Okay, so that's kind of a cool one. So this is a hand that I wouldn't even be surprised when I made these slides if I was check calling 6-5 of hearts here regularly. I probably still was entertaining the idea of check raising it, but now I like the idea of check raising it much more than I did 2 months ago. And part of that's from having, well, I don't need to go into detail with that, but the reason why I like check raising 6-5 of hearts is it has some very robust equity. It can make the opponent fold. We have 6 high. Every time we make our opponent fold, he folds the hand with more equity. And we need to be check raising some flush draws, but the flush draws that I wouldn't want to check raise are often the ace high ones because those flush draws have showdown value. 6-5 of hearts has no showdown value, and I don't want to check a call with 6-5 of hearts. Then the turn card comes like a 7 of diamonds, and I go, ugh. Because then, if my opponent bets on the 7 of diamonds turn, I don't really want to check call. I don't really want to check fold. Check raising might sometimes be good there because maybe I can represent like king 7, but I can't get out of line with that. So because it's kind of difficult to play 6-5 of hearts after we check call and the turn card comes a non-heart, non-6, non-5, I'd rather just go ahead and get the check raise in now, try to make our opponent fold a better hand, and then we can keep barreling, the turn aggressively. Queen 10 of hearts. So this is very similar to an ace X of hearts, where it's only this queen 10 of hearts is obviously clearly better. Queen 10 of hearts has a lot of showdown value. Obviously, it has a middle pair with good kicker. So queen 10 of hearts has some robust equity, which is the flush draw, right? If our opponent's range gets stronger, the second nut flush will usually still win, even if our opponent's range gets stronger. So the flush draw is the robust equity. The trips in the 2 pair are also quite robust. Even if our opponent's range is strong, trips queens with a 10 kicker is pretty good. So we have this like robust equity component, and then we have the non-robust equity component, which is just the pair of queens that doesn't improve. But to more effectively utilize the non-robust component of our hand, the pair of queens, we need to check call that, because if we check raise, we're going to make our opponent fold a lot of hands that we beat and weren't likely at all to outdraw us. And we're also going to make our opponent's range much stronger, so it's hard to check raise queen 10 and then still effectively win with a pair of queens at showdown. So for that reason, I would definitely check call the queen 10 of hearts, because check calling plays the non-robust component so much better. All right, so flop numero 60. Flop is Queen 5-3 Rainbow. So this board has a single high card, which alone means it's going to be pretty easy to check call. There also isn't much draw on this board, which makes check calling even still easier. And at the end of the day, when it's harder for our opponent to outdraw us with his bluffs, check calling is going to be easier. So here, there's just a lot of cards we can check call with where it's not very likely our opponent will outdraw us. All right, so easy value check raises. So what hands are you pretty much going to check raise for value here? I'd go with some Queen 5 and Queen 3, though I'd slow play pocket 5s and pocket 3s. So I just think pocket 5s and pocket 3s are strong enough that I feel comfortable check raising any turn card. Whereas with like Queen 3, maybe I wouldn't really want to check raise like a Jack or a 4 turn or something like that. So I'm going to go ahead and check raise the Queen 5 and the Queen 3 now and slow play the pocket 5s and pocket 3s. Yeah, if we slow play the Queen 5 and the Queen 3, we may lose action or let ourselves get outdrawn by calling. And then, as I already mentioned, if you still play Queen 3, you're going to get out. It's going to be hard to check raise on some turn cards. So even the 9 I listed here. And now you can very profitably check raise Queen 3 on a 9 turn. The problem with check raising Queen 3 on a 9 turn is we now lose to Queen 9, Queen 5, pocket 9s, and pocket 5s. So we just might lose to enough hands that it's no longer worthwhile to check raise Queen 3. So if you're going to check raise Queen 3, I think you're usually going to want to do it on the flop. Oh man. See, I made these slides like a month and a half ago, and then I don't remember it, so I'm saying all the stuff that's on the next slide, but cool. So yeah, you lose to quite a few hands if you're check raising Queen 3 on a 9 turn. So what are the easy check raise bluffs? And again, we're being super repetitive here because poker's super repetitive. So when I ask for the easy check raise bluffs, what hands have robust equity? So what hands can still win even if the opponent's range gets stronger? Those are going to be hands like 10-9 suited, 9-8 suited, Jack-10 suited, 8-7 suited, etc. Notice we don't always get pairs and 3 to a flush plus 2 to a straight, but we should usually try to emphasize them. So there's nothing wrong. I think it's quite good if you check raise 10-9 of clubs here, even though 10-9 of clubs is not 3 to a flush, 3 to a straight. 10-9 of clubs has a Jack, which gives an open and straight draw, an 8, which gives a gut draw, a 9 and a 10, which give pretty good pairs, and then a club, which gives a flush draw. So that's still a lot of good turn cards, even though it's not 3 to a flush, 3 to a straight. So yeah, go ahead and get aggro with that. Easy check calls, all Queen X, and most pairs with 5 outs to 2 pairs and trips. So before we move on, one thing I want to encourage you to think about a little bit is how often do you actually find yourself bluffing your entire stack off? Because I don't want to encourage people that are watching this that are playing low stakes to get spewy, but I'm guessing a lot of people just don't check raise bluff this flop nearly often enough and follow through on the turn and follow through on the river. So here, especially if you do have Queen 5 and Queen 3 in your range that you're sometimes check raising, or if you are check raising your sets here, really ask yourself, like, are you check raising enough like 10-9 suited type hands? Are you following through on the turn and the river enough? Because if you're constantly, playing for an entire week and at the end of the week you can't remember more than maybe 1 or maybe 2 times that you were really willing to bluff your whole stack, then that might be indicative that you're not bluffing enough. So here, just look at these, suited connectors type hands. Know that you are going to be able to effectively check raise, bluff them, and continue betting on the turn a lot. And the other thing I want to keep in mind is, especially at lower stakes, a lot of times if your opponents have very strong hands, they'll let you know quickly, which can save you money. So they might 3-bet on the flop a little too often, and that lets you fold your bluffs. They might raise you all in on the turn a little bit too often, and that lets you fold your bluffs. Whereas if they've kind of called your flop check raise and called your turn bet, then when you are going all in on the river, they might not have many strong hands, and they might be folding a little too much because they've already sort of shipped all their really strong hands. So anyways, I don't want to encourage anyone to get spewy, but I would challenge you to ask yourself, like, how often are you really bluffing off your stack? And if you don't think you're doing it often enough, then maybe consider bluffing a little bit more aggressively. And then lastly, the other easy check calls are most, if not all, ace-high hands. So a hand like ace-9 or ace-8 has good showdown value, not very likely to be outdrawn. You can check call most, if not all, those hands pretty comfortably. And then the last thing to keep in mind is notice when we have like ace-2 or ace-4, that's going to be a gut shot as well. So you're probably check calling most of the ace-high hands or check raising them if you choose to check raise like the gut shots. All right, so what about, so now we're going to do the hard ones. So ace four. So once again, I find this to be a relatively tricky hand because if we check call ace four, I kind of have to ask myself on a lot of turn and river combinations, like, you know, if I check called on the flop with ace four, turn went check check, and then my opponent, and then I'm on the river, do I end up turning ace four into a bluff to try to make my opponent fold some random pairs and some random ace highs that beat me? Or do I try to get to showdown with ace four? I think it's really tricky and I don't know the exact answer. So with ace four, I think you can make an argument for check calling it or check raising it. I think I check call it more than I check raise it, though I will be the first to admit it's pretty awkward to know whether or not to bluff ace four on the river because it sucks super bad if your opponent checks back and wins with like ace seven or a random pair of threes or maybe a random hand like pocket twos or whatever else he can have. So I'm probably mostly check calling with ace four, but I can see an argument for check raising it too. Pocket sixes. So in practice, I would pretty much always check call pocket sixes, but I think it's not that crazy to consider check raising it in theory because you might be able to check raise it, have your opponent call with some ace high hands or some 5x hands or some 3x hands, and then you win at showdown. And then if you do check raise and your opponent folds, you've almost always made them fold two overcards. So I would check call pocket sixes in practice. I think in theory, it could make sense to check raise it as a very, very advanced play. I'm more of just introducing you to it now because as people continue to get better and better, I don't think the idea of check raising pocket sixes is nearly as insane as probably most people think it is. So I would still encourage you to check call it. I would check call it, but I don't think check raising it is that crazy because you can make overcards fold and you can get calls from 5x hands, 3x hands, or ace-x hands that check down and then you win. 7-6 suited. So 7-6 suited, I'm going to be much more likely to check raise because it fits that usual criteria of hands, which is it has very, very robust equity. Whenever we make our opponent fold, he's always folding the best hand. And then, we have a gut shot and we have 3 to a flush. So I would almost always check raise the 7-6 suited. 6-4 suited or 6-4 off if we have them. We've talked about this a bunch too. You can check call them or check raise them. It's going to be very profitable to take either line, but I would try to emphasize the line that you think will let you see the turn in the river more effectively. So if you check call 6-4, it might be hard for you to check call again if the turn's like a 9 or a 10 and your opponent double barrels. So if that's the case, I'd be a little bit more likely to check raise 6-4. But you might also think to yourself, well, I can check call 6-4 on the flop, maybe check call it on the turn, or the turn might check through, or if the opponent does bet on the turn, maybe you can check raise bluff it. Especially if you are going to have some 2 pairs and a lot of sets to check raise on the turn. That seems reasonable too. So for 6-4, I don't really have a strong preference on whether you check raise it now on the flop or you do something creative on the turn, hopefully not having a check fold. Pocket 4s. Pocket 4s are a more interesting one. I still think it's very similar to the pocket 6s hand, so I don't want to repeat all that. Obviously, 4s are weaker than 6s. I would probably still go ahead and check call it. Don't really want to just repeat all the pocket 6s stuff. Pocket 2s, ugh. That's the closest one yet, I think. Pocket 2s is pretty gross, because with pocket 2s, on one hand, we probably have the best hand on the flop most of the time, but we're so unlikely to outdraw our opponent when he has us beat, and he's so likely to outdraw us when we have him beat. So 2s seem really tough to me. When it seems really close and I'm out of position, a lot of times I want to just fold, so that's what I think I would do here. But this is a spot where even though I think it's like a close fold, I'm not that confident in that. That could be a pretty bad fold in theory. So this is a good example of a spot where I think it's just really, really close, which is why I intentionally wrote that down probably a month and a half ago. Not sure. I'll probably become more certain after I write down what I would do with all my hand combinations on the flop here, and that's why I do that exercise. If I find out I think I'm folding way too much, then I'll probably start check calling 2s. If I find out I'm already defending plenty of ace-high hands and getting creative with other stuff, then I'm probably just going to muck it. So, think it's close, but I think I probably fold it. All right, final flop of the day. So, the flop is Ace-King-9 Rainbow. Again, this is a good flop. Yeah, we 3-bet a lot of our ace-x suited, but we also called with a lot of them, and they're super easy to play out of position because we're just not afraid of giving free cards with good pairs here. 2 high cards also means we have a ton of check call worthy hands, which makes it pretty easy to play out of position. And that said, even though our range is doing pretty well here, it's hard to donk bet here since we don't have that many premium hands, since we 3-bet them all pre-flop. So even though our range is doing pretty well here, this is not a spot where I would ever donk bet. All right, so what are the value check raises? Ace-9 and King-9, maybe pocket nines. Again, if you can have them in your range. I would 3-bet I would probably 3-bet pocket nines pretty often, but Ace-9 and King-9 I would probably cold call, and those hands are going to be in our range, at least the offsuit ones. In practice, I'd probably always check raise, but are we exploitable if we always or never check raise these hands? There should be a question mark there. Boom, the magic of cinema. Okay, so if we never slow play any strong hands, we probably can get our opponent's overbets will probably be too effective on the turn, so we probably have to slow play some of them, etc., etc. I know I'm like a broken record. End of the day, people aren't overbetting nearly enough, so that makes it much easier for us to just check raise the ball. I talked about this earlier. People have this rule that that should not exist. They have this rule that they bet 2/3 of the pot or they check. That rule restricts what they can do, and it makes our life a lot easier. So I'm just going to say to myself, hey, I'm just going to check raise all my strong hands on the flop because you're not going to overbet me on the turn, and I don't want to let you, runner me or hit a gut shot or something on the turn too cheaply. So yeah, I would just go ahead and check raise them all. How about some check raise bluffs? This one's kind of tricky since I think both check calling and check raising gut shots is fine. That's especially true since like Queen Jack, for example, and Queen 10 are like the nutted non-pair hands. So they do have some showdown value, although it's difficult to say whether we'd ever be able to really utilize that if we check call. So this is something that's really important. So make sure you're thinking as I say these next few words. Your showdown value doesn't matter really if you're always going to end up bluffing on the river anyways if the turn checks through. So what I mean by that is you might say like, hey, Queen Jack and Queen 10, yeah, they actually have some showdown value if I check call them. And they will sometimes, be able to win that showdown if we check call on the flop, turn goes check, then we check it on the river and our opponent checks back. But if it's still going to be more profitable for us to bet our Queen Jack on the river, because maybe, let's say the turn's a 7 and the river's a 5. Maybe we want to make our opponents fold random 7s, random 5s, random splits, random 9s. So if that's the case where we're going to bluff our Queen Jack anyways, even though it has showdown value, then it doesn't really make sense to say, oh, well, one of the advantages of check calling Queen Jack is it has showdown value. That said, one of the advantages of check calling with Queen Jack is, our opponent might have a worse Queen or a worse Jack that he bluffed with. That still counts. I just mean if we're not actually utilizing the Queen Jack showdown, the high card Queen, high card Jack showdown, then it's not really fair to say, oh, that's one of the big advantages of check calling is to retain that showdown value. So I think check calling's fine or check raising's fine. Both of those are fine here, but don't be afraid to check raise bluff some Queen Jack and some Queen 10. And then I'd for sure check raise through to a flush and through to a straight like 10-8, 8-7, 10-7 suited. So again, 3 to a flush through to straight. They just work so well as check raise bluffs. And if you have all the offsuit combos of Ace-9 and King-9, that's... Ooh, I should know this off the top of my head. How many combos is that actually? Well, this is how I would think about it. There's 3 aces left and 3 9s left. So 3 times 3 would be 9 combos, but 2 of those are going to be suited, which are going to be like Ace-9 of hearts and Ace-9 of clubs. So we have 9 combos of Ace-9 if we cold call preflop with our Ace-9 suited and Ace-9 off. We have 7 combos of Ace-9 preflop if we only cold call with Ace-9 off and we 3-bet our Ace-9 suited. So we have between 7 to 9 combos of Ace-9 and the King-9s. And then the pocket 9s are just going to be 3 combos each. So that's a lot of check raise worthy hands for value. So we need to get those check raise bluffs in there. So I would for sure check raise the 10-8 suited, 8-7 suited, 10-7 suited. I think you can do this pretty much on any stakes for any game. You're going to want to check raise these hands because they work so incredibly well. So note, once again, it requires an effort to find the check raise bluffs here. And if you do check raise and your opponent calls on the flop, and let's say he calls on like an 8 of spade turn, and let's say the river's like a 4 of hearts, he might have wanted to ship all of his really strong hands on the 8 of spades turn. So make the effort to find the check raise bluffs, and then don't be afraid to fall through on them, especially if you think your opponent would have already, 3-bet on the flop with his really strong hands, or jam the turn with his really strong hands. So make the effort to find the check raise bluffs, and don't be afraid to fall through. Again, really low limit players that watch this, all the time, good players bluff off their stack and run into 2-pair. Don't be afraid to have that happen once in a while. All right, so what are some easy check calls? So all ace X and king X stuff, I'd pretty confidently check call. There's no real reason to check raise it. You're obviously not going to fold it. And then I'm also going to for sure check call with the nines with the good kickers, especially if I think my opponent will likely double barrel on the kicker that gives us 2 pair. So queen 9, jack 9, 10 9, I definitely want to call with those since we're going to outkick our opponent when he has a pair of nines. And also, you know, we'll still be good when that like overcard comes, right? If we have jack 9 and the turn card comes a jack, it doesn't matter if our opponent made a pair of jacks, we're still going to beat him. So I would definitely check call with those. But what if we're packing pocket eights? Eights are trickier because when we're ahead of the opponent, he'll often be betting with a hand like jack 10, queen 10, and queen jack. Those each make up 16 combos for 48 combos total, and all those hands have a ton of equity against us even when we're ahead. So when we are ahead, we're constantly going to get outdrawn. Whereas when we're behind, we're really not going to outdraw our opponent. So if he has an ace or a king or a 9 and he bets, and I don't think our opponent should be betting many kings, but he'll definitely bet a lot of aces. It's just really unlikely we outdraw him. So that said, I still think eights are good enough to check a call. Because, you know, our opponent could have a hand like 7-5 suited that's just not going to really outdraw us. And eights do beat our opponent's really low under pairs. So I think eights are good enough to check a call. We don't want to check raise them. They're not going to play well as check raise at all. They can't like run or anything good really. So I think eights are good enough to check a call. As we get to like 7s and 6s, it gets a lot closer. And then if you have like 5s, 4s, and 3s and 2s in your range, I would just check fold them. Pocket 3s. All right, spoiler alert. I would check fold pocket 3s. 9-7 suited. So 9-7 suited is a good example of a hand where it's like, I have no problem if you check call this or check raise it. This hand has some robust qualities, you know, like it can turn the trips, it can turn the 2 pair, it can turn the runner, or it can turn remember the runner flush. The 2 pair might be trickier to get value. It might be harder to get a lot of value on like a 7-turn 3 river because our opponent might have a lot of 2 pairs that beat us. But for the most part, you know, I think it's fine to check raise some 9s, check call some 9s. And 9-7 suited would be a reasonable one to check raise. Well, all right, so now we're at the end of the video. So that brings us to the end of the first video, which consisted of us discussing one of the most important spots in No Limit Hold'em. This stuff matters a lot because it's occurring non-stop. You're constantly opening the button and the big blind calling, or you're constantly calling from the big blind against the button open. We, of course, can't look at this spot in isolation, but hopefully after first looking at button play, the bigger picture is starting to become clear. So I hope you've learned a lot from these few videos, even though we haven't counted out all the combos. We're going to write down what to do with all the combos in the next few videos. And the next video, I'm going to talk about, we're going to continue talking about like the most important spots in Hold'em, but the next video is going to talk about what do we do when we're in the button and we face a check, and I'm going to list every single hand combination. So I expect to learn a lot from doing that, and hopefully you'll learn a lot from watching that video. So I'm pretty excited about it. So hopefully you learned a lot from this video. We're going to keep building on it, and now that we hopefully have a good sense of what's the really close stuff, what looks like it's relatively easy to know whether or not to call or fold or bet, we'll be able to make, you know, good ranges when we write down every single hand combo. So hopefully you'll look forward to that. I'm looking forward to making them. Thanks for watching, and good luck at the tables. Take care, everyone. Bye.